Single Dad repaired the AC and spoke 7 languages to calm the guests. The CEO watched without a word. The air inside Easton Grand Hotel was thick with frustration and sweat. Outside, New York simmered under a record-breaking July heat wave, but inside the grand marble-floored lobby things were boiling for a different reason. A line of irate international guests crowded the front desk, voices clashing in a dozen languages. The central air conditioning had gone down just as the hotel was hosting an international linguistic symposium. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. "Can someone please fix this?" a British man barked, loosening his tie. A woman in an elegant silk sari fanned herself with a tourist brochure, her face glistening. A Japanese businessman muttered, rapidly, his voice rising with every incomprehensible reply from the staff. Behind the desk, Nina, the young receptionist, barely a year into the job, was floundering. "I'm so sorry," she repeated again and again, her smile stretched thin. "We're doing everything we can." She wasn't. No one was. No one knew what to do. Until a quiet click echoed from the service corridor. The man who emerged looked nothing like a savior. Ethan Cole, in his oil-smudged gray uniform shirt and jeans, moved with the unassuming presence of someone used to going unnoticed. Mid-30s with tired eyes but a composed posture, he carried a modest toolbox in one hand and a folded maintenance checklist in the other. Maintenance. Nina called her voice a little too sharp. "We have a code, red, in the HVAC. I saw the alert," Ethan said simply. "Where's the main duct intake? Somewhere over the grand lobby." She waved vaguely upward. "But please, just hurry." He nodded and walked straight toward the utility access panel, his boots echoing on the tile. As he worked, the room continued to descend into chaos. A German couple was arguing with the concierge about their ruined reservation. A woman with a heavy French accent insisted on speaking to someone who could understand her complaints. The heat wasn't just physical, it was turning the room into a powder keg of miscommunication. Then Ethan stood up. He stepped away from the panel momentarily and approached the French woman. "Excusez-moi, madame," he said gently. "Je suis désolé pour la chaleur. Nous réparons le système maintenant. Vous pouvez attendre ici avec de l'eau fraîche." The woman blinked, then nodded, visibly soothed. He turned to the German couple. "Entschuldigung, die Klimaanlage wird in 10 Minuten repariert. Bitte bleiben Sie ruhig, wir kümmern uns darum." The couple fell silent, confusion and surprise, overtaking frustration. One by one, Ethan addressed each guest, switching from language to language as fluidly as a conductor shifting tempo, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, Arabic, Russian. He even joked gently with a small Korean boy by the fountain, asking if he wanted to help fix the AC. Within minutes, the noise had quieted. People were still sweating, yes, but they were calmer, united not by language but by the presence of this unexpected anchor in the storm. Above the lobby, behind a tinted glass panel overlooking the scene, Claire Easton stood frozen. She had arrived just moments earlier, drawn by the growing guest complaints and the breakdown alert on her tablet. As CEO of the Easton Grand, she had built a reputation for precision, efficiency, and keeping her distance. She didn't get involved in frontline drama, she solved problems from the top. But now, from the second-floor balcony, she couldn't look away from the man below. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, his jaw was unshaven, his hair tucked hastily under a cap, but there was a quiet dignity to him. And the way he moved through the room, steady, grounded kind, was something she hadn't seen in a long time. Claire tapped her earpiece. "Who is?" that she asked her assistant on the other end. Which one came the voice? The technician. Speaking. "What is that 7 languages? Hold on." A pause. Then, "That's Ethan Cole. He works night maintenance. Single dad. Keeps a low profile. We almost didn't hire him, he was overqualified." Claire's gaze sharpened. Overqualified, PhD in linguistics, some university background. Left academia a few years ago. She looked again. Ethan was now back at the intake panel, hands deep in wires, calmly humming something under his breath. 2 minutes later, the system gave a low, mechanical groan. Then a hiss. and finally the satisfying whoosh of cold air pouring from the overhead vents. A cheer broke out in the lobby. Guests clapped spontaneously. Someone whistled. Ethan didn't smile. He just nodded once quietly packed his tools and headed toward the back hall like a man finishing a chore. Claire remained perfectly still. The moment had been small, unscripted, barely visible from the surface. But to her, someone who had seen boardrooms filled with performative gestures and empty charisma, what she had just witnessed felt real. Raw, unpolished humanity. She didn't even notice she was gripping the glass railing until her knuckles turned white. Down below, Ethan disappeared into the corridor without so much as a thank you from staff or management. Like a ghost, unseen, unappreciated, and yet absolutely essential. Claire turned away from the window, her mind already racing. That man had just de-escalated a multilingual crisis, repaired a critical system in record time, and managed to do it with grace, humility, and not 1 ounce of ego. Who the hell was Ethan Cole, and why did she suddenly care so much? The next morning, Claire Easton sat in her corner office with the blinds drawn, halfway shielding her from the mid-morning sun. Her desk was lined with paperwork she normally flew through, but today her pen had stopped moving. Her thoughts were still rooted in the lobby last night. She had rewatched the security footage twice. Not because she didn't believe what she saw, but because something about it had stirred a part of her that had been dormant for years. That moment when Ethan had kneeled to speak to the Korean boy in his own language, just a soft-spoken sentence, a gentle smile, and the child had laughed, wiping tears with his sleeve. It stayed with her. Not a lot of things stayed with Claire Easton. She was a woman of movement. Fix it, file, it move on. But this didn't move on. It asked her to stay. She tapped her desk intercom. Nina. A moment later, the young receptionist poked her head in. Yes, Miss Easton. Close the door. Nina blinked and obeyed a little stiff. Claire looked up from her desk. You were working the front desk during the HVAC failure last night. Yes, ma'am. It was a nightmare, but it didn't escalate. The technician. Ethan. He handled the guests, Nina said, her tone tightening slightly. Claire picked up on it. You don't sound impressed. Nina's voice went clipped. He's good at fixing things, sure. And yes, the languages were a surprise, but I think some people are just good at putting on a show. He knows how to make people feel like he's some kind of saint. Claire frowned. You think he was performing? I think he knew you were watching. I wasn't on the floor. There are always eyes, Nina replied carefully. Claire didn't answer. Instead, she reached for her tablet and pulled up Ethan's employee file. Ethan Cole, age 38. Position Night Maintenance Technician Education, Ph.D. in Applied Linguistics. Columbia University Previous Employment Adjunct Professor Language Dept. NYU years with Easton, Grand 2. Claire leaned back. A Ph.D. from Columbia, adjunct at NYU. What was he doing replacing air filters and duct belts at midnight? She scrolled further and found a note buried deep in HR comments. Candidate appears overqualified but insisted on night shift availability due to personal schedule. Background check clean. Polite, quiet, respectful. Her fingers paused over a line, single parent. 1 dependent. Medical accommodations requested. Medical, she tapped again. The system, of course, redacted any personal health information regarding dependents. But her mind filled in gaps. She remembered the faint lines around his eyes. Not the lines of age, but of worry. The kind that deepens from watching someone you love fight a silent battle. The more she read, the more the story behind Ethan Cole pressed through the cracks. A gifted man. A kind soul, hiding in a job far beneath his capability. For what? The answer was obvious for someone he loved more than language itself. Claire stood and walked toward the window, looking down at the garden courtyard. A small group of guests milled about with coffee chatting under parasols. The city buzzed in the distance. She saw her reflection in the glass sharp suit arms cross the image of control, but inside her mind was spiraling. Years ago, she had built her reputation on one rule: never get too close. It was how she survived the betrayal of her own trust at a crucial moment in her career. Empathy had once cost her dearly. She wasn't about to make that mistake again. And yet... Her gaze dropped to a maintenance worker walking toward the east building with a toolkit in hand. It wasn't Ethan, but for a moment her heart had lifted. That afternoon, Claire requested a service in her office. The wall panel thermostat had been running cold, and it was just the excuse she needed. At 2:05 p.m., there was a soft knock on the door. She turned, masking her nerves. "Come in." Ethan entered, toolbox in hand. His uniform was clean today, but his hair still stuck up slightly in the back and his sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbow. He offered a courteous nod. "You called for service, ma'am." She gestured to the panel. "Thermostat's been odd. Too cold. I thought maybe a recalibration I can check that," he said simply. As he walked to the wall, Claire watched him, his focus, his stillness. It was the calm of someone used to listening more than talking. "You were impressive last night," she said finally. He paused, glancing back. "Thank you. You knew exactly what to say to each guest." He offered a half smile. "It helps when you know the words they need." Claire's eyes narrowed not with suspicion but curiosity. "You studied linguistics." "Yes." "Why are you here?" Ethan straightened. He could have brushed it off with a joke, but instead he met her gaze with steady honesty. "My son's been sick since he was 6. I needed a job with nights free and steady benefits. Academia didn't offer either." Claire's chest tightened, though she didn't show it. "I'm sorry to hear that." He shrugged gently. "He's the strongest person I know. Makes this..." He gestured around the room. "Easy." They stood in silence. For a long moment, nothing moved but the quiet hum of the building. Claire studied him not as an employee but as a man. There was no bitterness in him, no resentment, just quiet resilience. "You fixed the thermostat," he said, turning back to the panel. "You just didn't know it." She raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "You made the call." "That's the first step." And with that, he packed his tools and left the door clicking softly behind him. Claire remained standing for a long while, staring at the thermostat. The temperature in the room hadn't changed, but something in her had. By the time the next evening settled over Manhattan, the Easton Grand had returned to its smooth, polished rhythm. The symphony of clinking glasses in the rooftop bar, the soft hush of elevator doors opening and closing, the subtle nods of bellmen in black vests, all signs that the machine was working again. But Claire Easton's thoughts were anything but smooth. She sat at the end of a long conference table in a closed executive boardroom, barely hearing a word her assistant was saying about vendor contracts. A name kept echoing in her mind like a half-forgotten tune: Ethan Cole. She had built her entire brand on understanding systems, business models, interpersonal dynamics, risk matrices, but this man, he didn't fit into any matrix. He didn't demand attention. He didn't maneuver for opportunity. He simply existed, quiet, capable, invisible. And that made him impossible to ignore. "Cancel the 11 a.m. site visit tomorrow," Claire said suddenly. Her assistant blinked. "Would you like me to reschedule?" "No," Claire said, standing. "I'll be handling something personally." The following day, Claire appeared in the Lower East Wing unannounced, clipboard in hand, wearing a simple slate blue blouse instead of her usual blazer. She told the front desk she wanted to observe infrastructure alignment firsthand, which sounded technical enough to avoid questions. But really, she just wanted to see him work, without the scripted performance of a request, without the forced politeness of a meeting. Just the man behind the tools. She found him on the service floor inspecting a junction box near the back kitchen. He wore the same work uniform, slightly frayed at the collar, but there was something almost meditative in how he moved, checking, adjusting, double-checking. Alone, unnoticed. Claire stood back, arms crossed, observing for a full minute before speaking. "Not many people triple-test voltage," she said. Ethan didn't jump. He looked up, recognizing her instantly, but his expression remained even. "I've learned it's better to check 3 times than explain once why something exploded." A faint smile crept into her lips. "You have a way with words." "It was a past life," he replied, closing the panel and standing. They began walking together down the corridor. Claire noticed that every time someone passed another employee, a cleaner, a chef, Ethan nodded or greeted them. No one flinched. No one feared him. And yet no one seemed to fully see him either. "You really did teach?" she asked, almost hesitant. "For about 7 years. Columbia, then NYU. I loved it. But things changed. Because of your son," Ethan gave a small nod. "Leo was diagnosed with primary immunodeficiency. Lots of hospital visits, lots of uncertainty. The university didn't exactly love unpredictable schedules." Claire was silent. She could imagine the boardrooms, the meetings, the silent reshuffling of courses until his were the first to go. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be," Ethan replied, not bitter. "I get to walk my son to school every morning. That's worth more than tenure." Claire's throat tightened at the casual strength in his voice. They entered the service stairwell and climbed toward the rooftop maintenance corridor. Claire paused on the landing and looked at him. "Why not tell people what you've done? Your degrees, your background?" Ethan shrugged. "Because it's not who I am now, and if I talk about it too much, I might start missing it." Claire swallowed, feeling something shift in her chest. They reached the rooftop access. Wind rushed around them as the door swung open. The city sprawled before them, alive, pulsing. Ethan stood by the cooling tower checking pressure gauges. Claire stayed back watching the skyline. "I used to think the higher up you went, the clearer the view got," she said. Ethan turned to her. "And turns out it's just more noise. You just stop hearing the people at the bottom." He studied her. "You don't seem like someone who forgets where she came from." Claire smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You'd be surprised." They stood in quiet for a moment, the wind tugging at their clothes, the rooftop humming with quiet machinery. Then Ethan spoke, not looking at her. "Claire, why are you really here?" It wasn't rude, it wasn't presumptuous, it was just honest. She took a breath. "Because last night, I saw something that reminded me of what this place is supposed to be." He tilted his head. "A hotel at its best is more than chandeliers and 5-star menus. It's a safe place for people who are far from home, and you somehow made people feel that, with a wrench in one hand and 7 languages in your back pocket." Ethan looked down, almost embarrassed. "You reminded me," she said, "that connection doesn't come from position. It comes from presence." Their eyes met then. No romance, no subtext. Just human recognition, deep and real. He cleared his throat. "Do you want to meet?" Claire blinked. "Now. After my shift. We always get milkshakes on Fridays. He'll like you. He thinks people who wear heels are probably superheroes." A surprised laugh escaped her. "That's a first. I told him you were my boss. He asked if you could speak alien. I said we'd find out." Claire grinned. "Then I suppose I have a standard to meet." Ethan nodded, smiling. "Meet us at the corner diner. 6 o'clock. She hesitated, but then nodded softly. "All right." As they walked back inside, Claire felt something she hadn't in years. A beginning. Not of a romance. Not yet. But of trust. And in her world, that was rarer than love. The bell above the door chimed as Claire stepped into the small corner diner, her heels tapping softly against the checkered floor. It was the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a waitress with a name tag that read Bev in cursive. She was 5 minutes early. She chose a booth by the window, adjusting her blazer. The city buzzed outside, golden hour stretching long shadows down the street. For a brief moment, Claire wondered if she had made a mistake, if this was too personal too soon. She wasn't accustomed to blurring lines. But then the door opened again and Ethan walked in. He wasn't in uniform this time. Just a plain navy t-shirt and jeans, worn but clean. His hair was slightly damp, as though he'd rushed a quick shower after his shift. At his side was a boy maybe 10 years old with sandy brown hair, large eyes, and a red NASA cap that was a size too big. Claire stood. Ethan smiled. "Claire, this is Leo. Leo, this is Ms. Easton." Leo looked up at her wide-eyed. "You're the boss of everything." Claire crouched, slightly amused. Only the elevators and the scrambled eggs. The boy grinned. They slid into the booth, Leo between them, already pulling a laminated menu toward him. "I'm allowed to order anything," he declared, "even pancakes for dinner." Ethan shot Claire a look. "One night a week, I lose jurisdiction." Claire smiled. "Seems fair." They ordered milkshakes, vanilla for Leo, chocolate for Ethan, and strawberry for Claire, and pancakes for the table to share. The moment the waitress left, Leo leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Dad said you know about languages," he said. "Do you speak alien?" Claire played along. "Only on Wednesdays." Leo tilted his head. "What about cat?" "Just the attitude, not the grammar." The boy laughed, a bright, unfiltered sound. Claire felt it ripple through her, unexpectedly warm. For the next half hour, the conversation flowed like something from another life. Claire found herself answering Leo's riddles, joining Ethan in a back and forth on the quirks of language like why read and read look the same, but sound different, and even listening as Leo proudly recited the names of all 8 planets plus Pluto, just in case it makes a comeback. But in the lulls between laughter and syrup, Claire watched Ethan with growing admiration. He never interrupted his son, never dismissed a question. When Leo's hand trembled slightly while holding his glass, Ethan subtly steadied it without making a fuss. And when the boy coughed halfway through a laugh, Ethan's hand instinctively reached into his backpack for a small inhaler. It was seamless, practiced, tender. Leo, Claire said gently, "Your dad tells me you're very brave." The boy tilted his head. "Because of the hospitals, because of everything she said. Most kids your age don't know what it means to stay strong." Leo shrugged. "I just get tired sometimes. But Dad says we're a team." Claire glanced at Ethan, whose expression was quiet but fierce. "And what about your mom?" she asked softly. Leo's eyes dropped. He stirred his milkshake with his straw. "She passed away when he was 3, Ethan said after a pause. "Leukemia." Claire's chest tightened. "I told him she still listens," Ethan added. "So sometimes he leaves messages for her." Leo perked up. "I wrote one last week in 4 languages. Yeah, English, French, Spanish, and emoji." Claire laughed gently. "That's universal." Ethan reached across the table and ruffled Leo's hair. When the bill came, Claire tried to reach for it, but Ethan stopped her with a shake of his head. "Friday night pancakes are on me." She didn't argue. Something about the moment felt too whole to spoil with polite power games. As they stepped outside, the sky was turning deep blue, the city lights blinking to life like fireflies. Leo skipped ahead to the corner, pointing at a mural painted on the side of a building. "I like her," he told Ethan, not quietly. Claire chuckled. "I'm standing right here, you know." Leo grinned. "Good. You should know." Ethan looked at her a little embarrassed, but mostly proud. Claire turned to him. "Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for saying yes." They stood there for a breath too long. Not romantic, not yet, but real. Something between them had shifted gently, quietly like soil parting for a seed to grow. Before she could speak again, Leo returned, taking his father's hand and yawning. "Big day tomorrow," Ethan said. "Leo has an allergy consult." Claire nodded, stepping back. "Let me know if I can help." He hesitated. "Actually, there might be something." She looked at him, curious. "There's a trial program. Immune therapy. It's expensive, and the wait list is brutal. But if I could just get him on the radar?" Claire didn't speak. She reached into her purse, pulled out a business card, and scribbled something on the back. "Call this number tomorrow morning. Use my name." Ethan blinked. "Claire, it's not charity," she said firmly. "It's what people do when they care." He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you." Claire nodded. "Good night, Leo." The boy waved, already leaning into his father's side. Claire turned and walked down the street, heart both lighter and heavier. Somewhere in her chest, where ambition used to be sharp-edged and cold, something softer had begun to take root. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in years she wanted to follow it. The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It crept in quietly the way real storms often do inside people, not in the sky. For Claire Easton, it started with a boardroom meeting. Rain tapped against the panoramic windows of the Easton Grand's 27th floor executive suite as Claire sat at the head of the long lacquered table. Her senior team flanked her on both sides. Laptops glowed, coffee steamed, smiles were stiff. But Claire's focus was elsewhere, on a name highlighted in a report on her screen. Ethan Cole, status: part-time, non-essential operations staff. Suggested for inclusion in Automation Restructuring Phase 2, we can reduce labor costs by nearly 12% if we transition all routine systems checks to AI-assisted diagnostics and automated maintenance alerts, one of the directors was saying. It's already being piloted in our Chicago location. Claire blinked, coming back to the moment. And that would replace whom exactly? Primarily night shift maintenance, the man replied. Text like Ethan Cole. There it was, spoken out loud, like a verdict. Claire kept her face neutral. Is this being proposed across the entire chain? Yeah, we've identified a list of candidates whose tasks are 85% automatable. Another director chimed in, nodding. They're great people, but we're running a business, not a charity. The words hit her like a slap, though she didn't flinch. She stared at the glowing screen. Ethan's name. Leo's face flashing in her mind, laughing over pancakes, asking if she spoke alien, waving goodnight like she was someone who might matter. Claire felt a cold knot twist in her stomach. She knew what she should say. Approve the proposal. Stay neutral. Follow the model. No personal exceptions. But she also remembered what Ethan had said that night on the rooftop. If I talk about it too much, I might start missing it. Claire closed the report. We'll revisit this next quarter, she said sharply. A few people exchanged glances. Ms. Easton. We've had no system failures under Mr. Cole's watch in 2 years. Customer satisfaction has remained high. The incident last week was handled better by him than by our own front desk. He's not non-essential. He's the reason our brand still means something. The room went silent. Rain continued its soft percussion outside. Claire stood, meeting adjourned. That evening, she didn't go home. She didn't go to the gym or the rooftop lounge or the endless list of places she used to go when she needed to feel in control. Instead, she walked the quieter halls of the hotel's lower levels, the heartbeat of the building, pipes, boilers, buzzing circuits. And she found herself outside the custodial break room, a humble, windowless space that smelled faintly of coffee and metal. Inside, Ethan was sitting alone, eating from a plastic container. A tablet rested beside him, open to a medical journal. He looked up, surprised. Claire. She stepped in and closed the door behind her. You read immunology papers on your break. He gave a small smile. Helps me feel less helpless. Claire hesitated, then sat across from him. They want to automate your position, she said, skipping all pretense. Ethan didn't look surprised. I figured. You're not just a cog in the machine. I know, he said gently. But I also know I don't get to ask for exceptions. Not when the world's chasing margins. Claire looked down at her hands. She hadn't worn her rings today. It made her feel strangely bare. I pushed it back, she said. But it won't hold forever. The numbers, they don't care about values. Ethan's voice was quiet. Then make the numbers care. She looked at him. "Use me," he continued. "Put me where people see what it means to choose humans over machines. Train staff, speak to guests, build programs that only a person can deliver." Claire blinked. "You want to stay and do more. I want to matter. And I want Leo to see me doing something that matters." The simplicity of it, his clarity tore through her. "I don't know if I can protect you in the long term," she whispered. "I'm not asking for protection," he said. "I'm asking for purpose." Silence, thick but not heavy, like something being reforged in fire. Claire stood. "Let me think." Ethan nodded. But before she left, she turned back. "I had a father who chose the business over family. He thought success made up for absence." Ethan tilted his head. Claire met his eyes. "You're the first man I've met who gave up success to be present, and I've never admired anything more." Then she was gone. The next morning the storm hit hard this time, literally. A city-wide blackout triggered by a grid overload during an early spring heat wave. Elevators froze. Backups failed. Guests panicked. Chaos brewed again in the Easton Grand's gilded halls. But this time, Ethan was ready. While management scrambled, he led a crew of 3 junior techs calming guests in 4 languages, setting up emergency lights and manually rebooting elevator systems. In the middle of it all, he paused to reassure a nervous child trapped on the 3rd floor with a whispered story about how power comes back faster when we stay brave. Claire watched the whole thing from the mezzanine, hands gripping the railing, heart pounding not in fear, but awe. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't flashy. He just showed up. Again. For strangers. For her brand. For his son. For truth. By the time power returned, several guests were asking who he was. Someone called him the calm in the storm. Claire smiled. They had no idea just how true that was. The next morning, Ethan woke before the alarm the way he always did. He didn't need a clock anymore. His body moved on instinct, now calibrated by hospital visits, Leo's school schedule, and late-night maintenance calls. His small apartment was still and dim, the first light of dawn sliding across the hardwood floor like a quiet visitor. He tiptoed into the kitchen and brewed a modest cup of coffee. From the bedroom came the soft rustle of sheets and the faint wheezy breathing of a child still asleep. Leo had a checkup later that afternoon. Ethan had taken the day off. It wasn't optional. He never missed doctor days, even if it meant dipping into unpaid leave, even if it meant choosing between groceries and medication later. As he sipped his coffee, a notification pinged on his phone. It was from the Easton Grand HR portal. Routine system update, it read. But something about it made his stomach twist. He didn't open it. Instead, he packed Leo's backpack with snacks and the latest illustrated encyclopedia about space, then carefully folded the appointment papers into his worn canvas bag. The insurance claim form fluttered out and landed on the counter. Pending. Still. Across the city, in a private office 3 floors above the Easton Grand lobby, Claire was on the phone with a man named Dr. Kent Holloway, the director of pediatric immunology at the Stanton Research Center. "I'm not asking for a handout," she said firmly. "I'm offering a referral." On the other end, Holloway hesitated. "Claire, our clinical trials are at capacity. These cases are reviewed by board vote. The waiting list is 6 months minimum. He's 10 years old, Kent," she said, her voice sharpening. "He's smart. He's curious, and his father is raising him alone while working night shifts to pay for inhalers. If he doesn't belong in your trial, then the system is broken." A pause. "Then I can send his file for a secondary review," Holloway said quietly. "Unofficially. But I can't promise anything." "I don't need a promise," Claire replied. "Just a door not locked shut." She hung up, fingers tight around her phone, the weight of the world heavier than her tailored blazer. For a woman used to commanding boardrooms and restructuring budgets in her sleep, this was different. This was personal. And for the first time, it felt right. At the hospital later that afternoon, Ethan sat beside Leo as a nurse checked his vitals. Leo was unusually quiet. His eyes focused on a sticker chart on the wall. The doctor arrived 15 minutes late, distracted, and barely looked Ethan in the eye. Standard tests, standard notes, standard caution about immune exposure risks. You'll need to refill the immunoglobulin prescription, the doctor said, offhandedly flipping pages. Out of pockets about the same this time. Ethan nodded mechanically, masking the tightness in his chest. Afterward, while waiting in the hallway for the prescription printout, his phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello, Mr. Cole." The voice was smooth official. "This is Stanton Research Center. You've been referred for preliminary evaluation for the pediatric trial in immune therapy." Ethan froze. I didn't apply. There was a direct referral by name," the voice continued. "A Claire Easton. I know who she is," Ethan said, barely above a whisper. "We'll need your son's records. If all aligns, you'll be invited to our evaluation intake next week." Ethan ended the call slowly, the hallway spinning just slightly. Claire. She had done this. Silently. Without fanfare. He looked down at Leo, who was squinting at a vending machine filled with juices. "Dad," the boy said, tugging at his hand. "Can we get the grape kind this time?" Ethan crouched beside him, hand on his shoulder. "Buddy, we might be able to get something even better soon." Leo smiled, as only a child could, believing without asking why. That night, Ethan stood in his apartment kitchen long after Leo had gone to sleep, fingers resting on the countertop. The quiet hummed around him. The refrigerator clicked on and off. He thought of the woman who had handed him a card without strings. The woman who saw more than a technician, more than a single dad with too many tired miles in his eyes. She had opened a door without asking him to prove his worth. He wanted to call her. He didn't. At the Easton Grand, Claire sat in her office with the lights dimmed, staring out at the skyline. She'd kept her promise. Quietly. It wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure someone else didn't feel invisible anymore. There was a knock. Mr. Howard, the building's head of security, a gruff man in his 60s who rarely knocked, peeked in. "Evening, ma'am. Just wanted to let you know we had a few guests ask who handled the power outage yesterday. Said someone spoke to their kids in their native tongue, calmed them down." Claire looked up. "They're asking for a name to write in the guest commendation." "Give them one," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Ethan Cole." Howard nodded, then paused. "You know, a man like that don't come around often. Most folks go their whole careers never meeting someone like him." Claire met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I know." He hesitated again, then stepped in and handed her a small envelope. "Found this. Think it's yours." It was her business card, the one she'd given Ethan. Now returned, with something scribbled on the back. "Thank you for seeing what no one else did." Claire held the card in her hand for a long time, her fingers trembling just slightly. She wasn't used to being thanked. She wasn't used to feeling this much. But tonight she wasn't the CEO behind the glass office. She was just a woman, sitting alone, holding a note from a man who, without even realizing it, had reminded her of who she used to be before power, before performance. Someone who still believed in good things, quiet things, real things. The lobby of the Easton Grand was unusually quiet for a Thursday morning. The fountain in the center gurgled softly, and sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting geometric patterns onto the tile floor. Ethan stood just outside the staff lounge holding his time card. It was supposed to be just another check-in, but something about the atmosphere felt off. A few employees walked by without meeting his eyes. Nina, the young receptionist he'd once helped during the AC meltdown, passed him with a polite but clipped smile. She usually waved, not today. He swiped his card, but the system returned an error. Access restricted. See supervisor. He frowned. He hadn't missed a shift. He hadn't violated protocol. What was going on? Upstairs, Claire was mid-meeting when her assistant Marissa leaned in with a whisper. "There's been a staff issue. Ethan Cole tried to access the main floor this morning. His credentials were flagged." Claire's eyes narrowed. Why? Marissa hesitated. A system reclassification went through overnight. It came from HR, but the trigger wasn't from you. Claire stood ignoring the silence in the boardroom behind her. Put everything on hold. Now. Down in the lobby, Ethan had just stepped outside when the familiar figure of Mr. Howard, the longtime head of security, approached. "Hey, Ethan," the older man said, voice low. "Can I talk to you a sec?" Ethan gave a tired smile. "If you're about to tell me I'm being replaced by a robot, I already figured." Howard's mouth twitched. "Nothing like that. Not officially, anyway. But word's going around. Word. That someone's been leveraging connections, pulling strings. Some staff say you're cozying up to the CEO for special favors." Ethan's expression darkened. "She got my son into a trial that could save his life," he said, voice tight. "I didn't ask. She just did it." Howard looked at him evenly. "I know, and I believe you. But not everyone thinks with their hearts in the right place. Some of them think you're making a play. Climbing, using sympathy." Ethan turned his gaze to the windows, his shoulders stiff. "I didn't ask for attention," he muttered. "I just wanted to stay invisible and raise my kid." Howard laid a hand on his shoulder. "Son, I've been in this building longer than the elevators, and I know a good man when I see one. But I also know what jealousy sounds like. It doesn't whisper, it spreads." Ethan gave a tight nod. "Can I at least go back to work today?" Howard hesitated. "You'd need to clear that with HR." That was when Claire's voice cut through from behind them. "He doesn't need to clear anything." Both men turned. Claire stood just beyond the revolving doors, her coat still on wind in her hair. Her eyes were locked on Ethan's, steady and unflinching. Howard nodded and excused himself silently. Ethan looked at her. "They think I'm exploiting you." "I know," she replied, "and it's my fault." He blinked. "What?" Claire stepped closer. "I acted without transparency. I pulled a string because I believed in your worth, but I didn't protect you from how that would look. That's on me." He exhaled. "It was never about favors." "You know that, right? I do," she said softly. "But the people watching us, people who don't know your story, they see moments, not meaning." Ethan looked down. "So, what now? I fix it," she said simply. "The right way." That afternoon, Claire called an all-staff gathering, rare, unexpected, and unprecedented. The ballroom lights dimmed as employees filtered in. Ethan stood near the back, arms crossed, still unsure what was about to unfold. Claire stepped onto the small stage. No slides, no microphone. Just her. "I want to talk to you," she began, "about what matters in this building." The room quieted. Hotels are built on image, perfection, performance. But behind every 5-star review is a person you don't see. Someone mopping a hallway at 2 a.m. Someone fixing a broken thermostat so a child doesn't cry. Someone who speaks to guests in their own language, not because it's in the job description, but because they can. She paused, letting the words settle. "I want to tell you about a man who gave up a career in academia to take a job here, not for money, not for glory, but because his son needed him more than a title ever could." Murmurs, recognition, eyes turning toward Ethan. That man is Ethan Cole, and the only favor he's ever asked is for a shot at doing the right thing, over and over again. Ethan froze as the room turned toward him. Claire stepped off the stage and walked to him. In front of everyone, she looked him in the eye. "If anyone here deserves a promotion, deserves a title, it's the person who reminds us that the heart of hospitality isn't marble or menus. It's humanity." She turned to the crowd. Effective immediately, Ethan will lead our new guest empathy and cultural outreach initiative. It's a role we created, not out of formality, but because we believe people still matter more than machines. Applause started slowly, then built, then filled the room. Ethan stood stunned. But in his chest, something cracked open, not pride, but purpose. Later that night, as he tucked Leo into bed, the boy looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Dad, are you famous now?" Ethan smiled. "No, buddy. But people heard my story today. That's enough." Leo yawned. "Are they going to hear mine too?" Ethan kissed his forehead. "They already are." The lobby looked different at night. Not because the lights were dimmer or because the music from the grand piano had faded into memory. No, it was the emptiness. The way a space built for noise and movement could suddenly feel like a memory frozen in marble. Claire stood alone near the concierge desk, arms crossed, her reflection caught in the lobby's polished floors. It had been hours since the staff gathering, but the applause still rang faintly in her ears. Not because it was loud, but because it felt real. And yet, something gnawed at her. She glanced at her phone. No new messages. Not from Ethan. She told herself he probably needed space, that stepping into the spotlight wasn't easy for someone who had learned to survive in the shadows. But deep down she feared something else, that by bringing him into the light she had shattered the fragile boundary of trust they'd spent weeks building. People don't stay when you put them on a stage. They run. She knew that. She had lived it. The next day, Ethan didn't show up for his new orientation meeting. HR called him. No answer. Marissa tried emailing. No reply. By noon, Claire left her office and took the elevator to the lower level herself. She walked past the maintenance bay, past the storage rooms, past the old break room with the squeaky vending machine. But Ethan's locker was empty. Everything, his tools, his gloves, even the small photo of Leo taped inside the door, gone. She stood there for a long time, unmoving. Then she turned, eyes burning, and walked back upstairs. That evening, Claire visited the hospital. Leo wasn't there. Neither was Ethan. The front desk confirmed Leo had been moved off the trial intake list. The appointment had been canceled. No reason given. No follow-up. She stood outside in the cold spring air, feeling as if the wind was trying to scrape something off her skin. Was this his way of walking out quietly, of refusing what looked too much like charity? She pulled her phone from her coat pocket and stared at his name on the screen. Her thumb hovered. She didn't press it. Didn't. Back at the Easton Grand. Mr. Howard, the old security chief, sat in his cramped office finishing a lukewarm cup of coffee when he noticed something odd on the camera feed, Claire alone descending into the employee basement. Again. He sighed. A minute later, someone knocked on his door. It was Nina. She looked nervous. I think I messed something up," she said, voice low. Howard raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I overheard Ethan thanking Claire after that hospital trial call. He didn't say much, just something about how she'd helped him without asking for anything in return." Howard nodded slowly. "And I told HR," Nina admitted. "Not to cause trouble, just—" She hesitated. "Just because I didn't know how to read it. And then people started whispering, and I didn't stop it." Howard leaned back, folding his arms. "Why tell me now? Because he's gone. And I didn't think he'd leave." Howard was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into the drawer and pulled out a small envelope. "He left this with me. Said I'd know the right time to give it to her." Nina frowned. "To Claire." "No," Howard said. "To you." Nina blinked. "Me?" Howard slid it across the desk. She opened it slowly. Inside was a short note in Ethan's handwriting. "We all carry the weight of what we don't understand. But the good news is we can always learn. No grudge, just hope." Nina pressed her lips together, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't deserve that," she whispered. "None of us do," Howard said gently. "That's why it matters." Hours later, Claire stood on the rooftop terrace of the hotel, the city glowing beneath her. The wind was sharp, but she didn't feel it. This had been their place once, just for one evening. A place where two people who had nothing in common except everything that mattered had stood side by side and spoken like old friends. And now, silence. She closed her eyes. Maybe she had misjudged. Maybe Ethan wasn't ready. Or maybe the world had simply pushed too hard too fast. Not every good thing survives the light. Still, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the business card he had returned, the one he'd scribbled his thanks on. She turned it over in her hand like a talisman. And then, suddenly, a thought. She ran back inside. The next morning, Claire went to Leo's school. She waited outside, standing among tired parents and guardians. The morning bell rang, and the flow of children poured toward the entrance. She watched, and finally she saw him. Leo, wearing that same red NASA cap holding his father's hand. Claire stepped forward. Ethan saw her at the same moment. Their eyes met. He froze. Leo looked up at him, then back at her, curious. Dad Claire walked slowly toward them, heart-pounding, unsure what to say. But when she reached them, she didn't speak to Ethan first. She knelt beside Leo. "I was afraid I broke something important," she said softly, "but I didn't mean to." Leo tilted his head. "Are you sad?" She smiled gently. "A little. Then Dad probably is too." Claire looked up at Ethan, eyes shimmering. "Why did you leave?" Ethan's voice was steady but quiet. "Because I wasn't sure if I still belonged. I'm not used to being someone people talk about." She stood slowly. "You weren't someone we were talking about, Ethan. You were someone we were learning from." Silence. Then Leo tugged his dad's arm. "Can she come with us to breakfast?" Ethan looked at Claire. "Do you want to?" Claire nodded. "More than you know." And just like that, the silence between them began to dissolve, not with grand speeches or apologies, but with the quiet trust of a boy who saw the truth before either of them did. The early morning light filtered through the high windows of the Easton Grand's lower level, casting long stripes of gold across the concrete floor. Mr. Howard moved slowly through the corridor keys, jingling at his side, clipboard in hand. It was quiet this time of day before the hum of guests, before the clatter of room service trays and bell carts. Just the building breathing. He paused outside the old maintenance locker room. Something tugged at him. It wasn't the usual instinct, the kind forged from decades in security, always sensing trouble before it surfaced. No, this was different. It felt like memory. He reached for the key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. There, taped to the inside of locker G17. Ethan's locker was an envelope. Simple, unmarked, but he knew it hadn't been there yesterday. Howard pulled it off the metal, gently opened the flap, and found a folded piece of paper inside. Not typed, handwritten. Neat, steady script. And across the top, in 7 languages, the same sentence repeated. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest truths. Below it, a letter, addressed to Claire. That same morning, Claire sat in her office, staring at her untouched coffee. Her calendar was filled with meetings she had no intention of attending. She kept thinking about Ethan's face outside the school, guarded, but not cold. A man, still willing to listen. She wondered what he'd say now. If he'd forgive her, if she had done enough to earn that. The chime of her intercom startled her. Ms. Easton Marissa's voice came through. "Mr. Howard's here. He says it's important. Send him in." Howard entered quietly, hat in hand, envelope held delicately between 2 fingers like a relic. "He left this," he said, "sometime in the night." Claire took it silently. Howard didn't linger. She opened the letter and unfolded the page slowly, almost reverently. Claire. By now, you've probably guessed that disappearing wasn't about the job. It was about the noise. The way kindness sometimes echoes louder than silence, and not everyone knows how to live with that. I didn't. I've spent years shrinking, trying not to draw attention, trying to keep Leo safe, trying to carry this life in both hands without letting it spill. And then you saw me. Not the role, not the resume. Me. You didn't just hold the door. You walked through it first so I wouldn't be afraid to follow. And that scared me more than anything, because no one had ever done that before. But this isn't a goodbye. It's a pause. a deep breath, a place between chapters. Leo needs to see the world not just through my lens but through yours too, the part of you that believes in people, that fights for them. And when he's old enough to understand everything that happened, he'll know that you were the one who reminded his father how to stand tall again. Until then, if you ever need me, look for the one speaking softly in the corner, in a language only the heart understands. Ethan Claire read the letter 3 times. By the end, her hands were trembling. Not with regret, with clarity. She rose, smoothed her blazer, and walked out of her office with purpose. 2 hours later, Claire entered a small bookstore cafe on the Lower East Side, a spot Ethan had once mentioned in passing. Best second-hand books and even better cinnamon rolls, he'd said. She stepped inside and saw him instantly. Not behind the counter. Not with Leo. Just sitting near the back, a coffee in one hand, a notebook open in front of him, pen moving steadily across the page. The same way he probably wrote that letter. He looked up. Their eyes met. And for a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan smiled gently without surprise, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. Claire walked over and sat across from him without a word. She placed the letter on the table between them, then laid her hand beside it, not reaching for his, not expecting. Just there. Ethan closed his notebook and exhaled softly. You got it. She nodded. I needed to hear it. He studied her face, the softness in her eyes. I wasn't sure you'd come. Claire smiled. You signed it until then. Not? Goodbye. That gave me just enough space to hope. A quiet settled between them, not awkward, not distant. The kind of quiet that spoke volumes. The kind where healing lives. After a moment, Ethan asked, Do you still think I should lead that outreach program? Claire tilted her head. No. His brow lifted, surprised. I think you should build it, she continued. From scratch. In your voice. In your way. Not because it saves your job, but because it might save the heart of this place. Ethan stared at her. I've already drawn up a proposal, she said, sliding a printed folder onto the table. But only if you say yes. He opened it. Read the title, Human First, the Empathy Initiative underneath it. A simple subline, curated by Ethan Cole. Later, as they walked outside into the spring air, Claire glanced up at the brightening sky. Leo came running around the corner, a science book in one hand, the red NASA cap bouncing on his head. Dad, Miss Claire, he shouted. Guess what? Pluto might be a planet again. They both laughed. As Leo grabbed Ethan's hand, Claire looked at them, the boy who carried the future and the man who had chosen love over legacy. And in that moment she knew something for certain. Not all heroes make speeches. Some just fix what's broken quietly, patiently until it works again. The Easton Grand buzzed with nervous energy. It was the 15th anniversary of the hotel's flagship opening, a landmark event for the company and a personal milestone for Claire. The grand ballroom had been transformed into an elegant showcase of the brand's history and future velvet-draped tables, shimmering chandeliers, a stage framed by LED panels scrolling the hotel's timeline. Every executive from the Easton chain had flown in. Clients, press, city officials all seated at circular tables, glasses clinking with champagne. It was the kind of night Claire used to thrive in, dignified, structured, strategically illuminated. But tonight, as she stood backstage adjusting the microphone clipped to her collar, Claire felt something new. A pulse beneath the polish. A story waiting to be told. Across the room, Ethan stood near the entrance, hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't wearing a uniform tonight. He wore a clean gray suit and a black tie, the kind that had clearly been worn before weddings or funerals, but tonight it carried none of that weight. Leo stood next to him, dressed in a little blazer and sneakers, practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad," he whispered, tugging Ethan's hand. "Are there famous people here?" Ethan smiled. "There's someone more important than that. People who remember what it feels like to be seen." Leo nodded solemnly as if that were more impressive than any movie star. Claire stepped onto the stage. The ballroom hushed. Spotlights shifted to her, casting her in that familiar pool of light, the one she used to command like a second skin. But tonight, she didn't feel like a CEO stepping into her kingdom. She felt like a person speaking to other people, and that made all the difference. "Good evening," she began. "Tonight we celebrate 15 years of excellence, but I want to begin by telling you a story, one that doesn't appear in any of our press releases." A pause. Every eye followed her, even the ones who were skeptical. A few weeks ago, a technician at this hotel fixed an AC unit during a critical guest incident. You might say that's routine. But what he did next wasn't. She glanced toward the far side of the room, caught Ethan's gaze. He spoke 7 languages to calm guests from 7 countries, not because it was his job, but because he could, because he saw panic and answered it with presence. A quiet wave moved through the crowd. Claire continued, "I found out later that he had once been a professor, that he gave up academia when his son got sick, that he took a night job no one notices so he could be the kind of father most kids never get to see." She paused, letting the words breathe. In our world, we reward what's visible. Titles, sales, metrics, but sometimes the people holding us together are the ones who never step into the spotlight. Until now. Claire stepped down from the stage. The lights followed her as she walked to the edge of the ballroom where Ethan stood frozen. She took a slow breath. "Ethan Cole," she said, voice clear but soft. "This hotel would not be what it is without you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "And I wouldn't be who I am now if I hadn't met you." Ethan stared at her stunned. Claire extended her hand, not to pull him forward, not to place him in the spotlight, just to meet him. Ethan reached for it. Their hands met in the space between noise and silence. And in that small gesture, the room felt something shift, not upward, but inward. Claire turned back to the audience. This is what real hospitality looks like. It's not marble floors or thread counts. It's choosing kindness when no one's watching. It's listening in a language someone didn't expect you to understand. Applause started slowly, then grew. Louder, fuller, real. Claire looked at Ethan, then at Leo, who had pressed both palms to his mouth in pure awe, eyes wide as saucers. Tears burned behind Claire's eyes, but she held steady. For once, she wasn't performing. She was just telling the truth. After the event, guests milled around, eager to meet the man behind the story. Ethan shook hands awkwardly, signed a few programs, answered questions with quiet humility. Claire found Leo standing alone near the dessert table, staring at a cake shaped like the hotel itself. "It's very square," he said. Claire laughed. "You're not wrong." He turned to her. "You made my dad happy again." She crouched beside him. "No, sweetheart. He was already whole. He just needed someone to remind him." Leo considered this. "That's like when the moon looks broken, but it's still there just hiding." Claire's throat tightened. Exactly like that. Later, as the crowd thinned, Ethan found her standing on the terrace outside the ballroom, city lights glittering below. "I wasn't ready for that," he said, coming beside her. "Me, either," she admitted. They stood in silence. "Are you still scared?" he asked gently. Claire exhaled. "Every day. But today, it didn't stop me." He nodded, then looked at her with that quiet certainty that needed no decoration. What if he asked this wasn't the ending? She smiled. "It's not." He glanced at the hotel behind them. "And what comes next?" Claire turned to him, her voice sure. "We build something better. Not just a new department, but a different way of leading, a different way of loving." Ethan took her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. Leo's laugh echoed behind them as he raced across the ballroom floor toward the piano. Ethan looked at her and said, "It feels like the beginning." Claire nodded. "It is." A year later, spring returned to New York, quietly without grand announcements, just the subtle shift of light in the afternoons, the soft scent of blossoms threading through the breeze and the hum of the Easton Grand resuming its quiet rhythm. But inside the hotel, something had changed. Not in the marble floors or the gold-plated elevators. Those were still there, still polished, still perfect. The real change lived in the people, the way they greeted each other in the hallways, the way they listened more closely, paused longer before speaking. It lived in a program now known across the entire Easton chain, the Empathy Initiative. And at the heart of it was a man who once worked underground, tightening bolts in silence. Now he stood in a sunlit conference room teaching front desk trainees how to say, "I'm here to help" in 6 languages, and how to mean it in all of them. Ethan Cole stood by the whiteboard, a marker in one hand, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. Behind him, a dozen new hires from all over the country leaned forward in their seats, not because he demanded it, but because his presence invited it. "Hospitality," he said, "drawing a circle isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's what happens when someone walks through our doors carrying a story and we meet them in it." He looked out at the room. You don't need to speak 7 languages to make someone feel seen. But you do need to listen like you would if you did. The class nodded slowly, letting his words settle. From the doorway, Claire watched arms folded across her chest, pride swelling in the quiet place behind her ribs. This was the vision that had once only lived in the margins of her heart. Now it was a living thing, walking and breathing in the hands of the man beside her. She stepped into the room as Ethan dismissed the class. The trainees filed out with notebooks, questions, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were about to do something meaningful with their careers. Ethan turned to her with a soft smile. "You didn't have to sneak in." Claire returned the smile. "I like hearing you talk when you forget people are watching." He tilted his head. "Is that why you never interrupt? I'm afraid if I speak," she teased, "I'll forget how to listen." Ethan laughed. "You're better at it than you think." She walked to the table where a stack of pamphlets sat, the new version of Easton's hospitality training materials, each one bearing his name. "You ever think you'd be doing this?" she asked. "Every now and then," Ethan said, "when I wasn't too tired to dream." He looked out the window. "Sometimes I still expect to be under a stairwell with a wrench, wondering if I made a mistake giving up my career." Claire stepped beside him. "And what do you think now?" Ethan looked at her. I never gave anything up. I just took a longer route to something better." That afternoon, the 3 of them sat outside the little corner diner, Ethan, Claire, and Leo sharing a plate of fries and milkshakes as sunlight bathed the sidewalk in gold. Leo was now 11, a little taller, his cheeks a little slimmer, his eyes still bright as stars. He wore a blue cap now instead of red. Space was still his passion, but he'd recently added architecture to the list. "I'm going to build a hotel that floats in orbit," he declared between sips. "Every room will have a telescope and 0 gravity beds." Ethan grinned. "Sounds like you'll need a good engineer." Claire winked. "And a really patient CEO." Leo nodded. "I already have both." They all laughed. Then Leo leaned back, sighing contentedly. This is my favorite part of the week." Claire glanced at Ethan. "Mine too," he said softly. The moment lingered warm, whole, unforced. No one needed to say what was growing between them. It had already taken root. In shared silences. In everyday kindnesses. In Friday milkshakes and rooftop glances and the way they reached for each other without thinking now. Love had arrived quietly, without fanfare, without declarations. But it was here. That evening, back at the Easton Grand, Claire stood beside Ethan in the staff lounge-turned-training suite. She held a folder in her hand, a proposal she'd been quietly building for months. She handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. "A scholarship," she said, "for hospitality students with family hardships. In your name." Ethan opened it, reading the mission statement. At the bottom, her signature. Next to it, space for his. "I thought we could launch it together," she said, "for the ones who were never seen." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. Not as a CEO, not as the woman who helped his son, not even as the person who once pulled him from the edge of invisibility, but as a partner. "You keep doing this," he said. "Doing what's speaking to people the way no textbook ever taught." Claire smiled. "You taught me that." He pulled a pen from his pocket, signed his name next to hers, and closed the folder. That night, after Leo was asleep, Ethan and Claire stood on the rooftop once more. The city shimmered below them, 1,000 lights blinking like distant stars. No one else was there. They didn't need to speak. Not tonight. Instead, they simply stood, hands-intertwined faces, tilted toward the sky. And in the hush between words and the comfort of a shared stillness, they both understood. The most powerful language was the one they had built together. Word by word, step by step. Love not as a performance, but as a quiet, everyday promise. We'd love to know where are you watching from. Let us know in the comments. It always warms our hearts to see how far these stories travel. If this story touched you, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next one. We're building a community that believes in kindness, healing, and hope, and you're a part of that. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care and keep believing in the quiet power of love. A single dad helped a female soldier in the rain. Then she got a letter that changed everything. The rain had been falling for hours, thick and heavy, like it meant to scrub the world clean. It drummed on the motel sign above Madison Greer's head, each drop cold enough to bite through her uniform, soak her skin, and settle into her bones. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay upright as the wind whipped at her wet hair. The glassy-eyed clerk behind the reception desk barely looked up as he handed her back her military ID. "No card, no room. Sorry, ma'am." His voice had all the warmth of the weather. Madison tucked the ID back into the inside pocket of her jacket and took a breath that trembled as it left her. She didn't argue, didn't beg. She just stepped back outside into the rain. Her duffel bag dragged against the pavement as she moved toward the road. Her boots were caked in slush, shoulders bowed under exhaustion, her breath fogging in the autumn chill. She'd tried 3 different places in the last 2 hours, and they'd all said the same thing. No vacancy, no cash accepted, no sympathy. The street was empty. The town was asleep. No headlights, no buses, no cabs. Just the rain and her. A neon open sign flickered in a convenience store across the street, but she didn't have the energy to cross. Her legs had started to cramp, the duffel strap digging into her shoulder like a punishment. A part of her, the small stubborn corner that had carried her through 14 years of service, kept walking anyway. One more block. One more mile. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe a pair of headlights cut through the downpour behind her. She didn't turn around at first. Cars had passed her for the last half hour, ignoring the uniform, the soaked pack, the way she stood like someone with nowhere left to go. But this one slowed. The engine idled behind her. She turned slowly, rain streaming down her face. The truck was old, dented, reliable. The kind of truck a man owns for 20 years and fixes himself. The window rolled down halfway, and a man leaned out, late 30s, maybe 40, a square jaw and dark, tired eyes under a damp baseball cap. "You need a ride?" he asked, voice low even. Madison didn't answer right away. She glanced at his hands. They were rough, calloused. Working hands. No twitchiness. No weapons. No flashing smile that meant something else. Just eyes that saw her, not a uniform, not a problem. Just her. Still she hesitated. "I'm not going far," he added. "But there's a diner a few blocks down. It's open late. You can dry off, get warm." The wind cut through her soaked clothes again, and that was answer enough. She nodded once and opened the door. The warmth hit her like a wave, stale coffee and motor oil, but better than the rain. She climbed in, closed the door, and settled the duffel on her lap like a shield. They didn't speak for the first few minutes. Just the swish of the windshield wipers and the hum of the engine. The truck creaked with every bump in the road. A stuffed dinosaur swung from the rearview mirror, its stitching worn, its tail half unraveled. She looked at him sideways. He didn't glance back. "You military?" he asked, still facing the road. "I was," she said, then corrected herself. Technically. Army, yeah." He nodded like he already knew. "I used to be a medic. Navy corpsman. Iraq." She blinked at him, surprised. He didn't look like it. But then neither did she anymore. "You out now?" she asked. "Long time. Got a kid now. Keeps me grounded." They reached the diner, a squat building with a flickering sign and glowing windows. It looked like a postcard from 30 years ago, cheap pie-hot coffee and nobody asking questions. He pulled into the lot and turned off the ignition. Madison reached for the door handle, but he stopped her. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. She shook her head. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded 20, then opened the glove box and handed her a motel key. "Room 4. Cheap keychain. Plastic tag." "I keep a room at that place near the tracks," he said. "Sometimes for guys coming out of detox. Sometimes for someone who just needs it. You can crash there. No strings." Madison stared at him. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because someone once did it for me." She took the key slowly, like it might disappear. "You hungry?" he asked. She started to shake her head, but her stomach answered for her. He smiled just a little. "Let's get something warm, then." Inside the diner, the waitress knew him. Called him Luke. Told him Ellie missed him tonight. He smiled, said he'd read her the bedtime story twice to make up for it. They sat in a booth by the window, steam curling from mugs of coffee between them. Madison stared at her reflection in the glass. Wet hair, red eyes, a woman on the edge, and realized it was the first time all day someone had looked at her like she wasn't broken. Luke didn't pry. He just ate his pie and offered her his half. She took it. When he dropped her off at the motel, she paused before getting out. "Thanks," she said. He nodded. "Get some rest." She walked to the room key, clenched in hand. But before going inside, she glanced back. The truck was still there, headlights glowing dimly through the mist, like he was waiting to make sure she'd made it in. She didn't wave. He didn't need it. But she stood in the doorway a long time, holding the key and thinking about how long it had been since someone stopped in the rain, and how sometimes it was enough to change everything. The motel room was barely bigger than a storage unit, with one flickering overhead light and the faint scent of mildew soaked into the walls. But to Madison, it felt like sanctuary. She peeled off her wet uniform with shaking hands and sank into the creaky mattress without even pulling back the covers. Her boots sat by the door, dripping quietly onto the mat. Her duffel bag rested beside them, everything she owned compressed into canvas and memory. Sleep came in fragments. Rain tapped at the window all night like it had something urgent to say. In her dreams, faces blurred people she'd served with people she couldn't save. People she tried not to remember. A door slammed somewhere down the hall and she jolted upright, heart pounding as if she were back in uniform, crouched behind sandbags waiting for orders that never came. When the sun finally rose pale and watery behind the clouds, Madison lay still for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling. She'd survived war zone's tribunal's betrayal. But somehow, waking up alone without purpose, without orders, this was harder. She reached for the folded motel key still on the nightstand and held it in her palm. It wasn't the room that mattered. It was the man who'd handed it to her without question. Luke. Just a name spoken once by the waitress. A man with quiet eyes, a little girl who missed bedtime stories, and a truck full of silence and warmth. She checked out of the motel 2 hours later. The clerk didn't recognize her. "Guy who paid for it, he come here often?" she asked. The clerk shrugged. "Sometimes. He drops off the envelopes. Pays in advance for strangers. Don't talk much. How do you reach him?" "You don't?" That was that. Madison stepped back out into the gray morning, her duffel slung across her back. She should have left it there, chalked it up to kindness from a stranger, and moved on. But something itched in her chest. Something unfinished. Something like hope. She headed toward the diner. The bell over the door jingled when she stepped inside. The place was mostly empty this early, save for a couple of elderly men reading newspapers and a teenager scrolling on his phone behind the counter. The same waitress from the night before appeared with a coffee pot and a warm smile. "Back already? Hungry looking for someone?" Madison said. "Luke." The waitress paused, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You a friend? I'm trying to be." She studied Madison for a moment longer, then nodded. "You just missed him. Works morning shifts 2 blocks over church maintenance. Try St. Joseph's. He's always early." The church loomed modestly at the edge of town, its stone steeple gray against the thick clouds. It wasn't fancy, but it had a quiet dignity, much like the man Madison hoped to find. She spotted him before he noticed her kneeling beside a flower bed, hands caked in damp soil. Sleeves rolled up his flannel shirt stained with work and time. He was humming something low and tuneless. Madison stood at the gate for a moment, unsure what to say. Then he looked up, saw her, and nodded like he'd been expecting her all along. "You found the place," he said. "I wasn't sure if I should." Luke stood brushing his hands on his jeans. "If you had nowhere else to be, then, yeah, you should." She smiled faintly, arms crossed against the chill. "You help a lot of people, don't you?" He shrugged. "Used to need a lot of help myself." There was no pride in his voice, just truth. Madison followed him as he walked toward the side of the church where a rusted storage shed leaned wearily against the brick wall. He opened it and pulled out a set of tools, handing her a wrench without asking. "If you're staying, you might as well earn your keep." She grinned. Subtle. They worked in silence, fixing the broken hinges on a warped door, reattaching gutter brackets. Her hands remembered how to be useful. It felt good. Grounding. For the first time in weeks, the buzzing in her head dulled. Afterward, they sat on the back steps of the church, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. "I used to be someone," she said quietly. "You still are." She didn't reply. Just watched the steam rise from her cup like smoke from a fire long burned out. "I'm not going to ask why you were walking in the rain," Luke said after a while. "But I know that kind of silence. The kind you wear like armor." Her eyes filled unexpectedly. She looked away. "I'm not used to people seeing through it." "Maybe you've been around the wrong people." She wanted to say something sharp, something defensive, but instead she just nodded. Luke stood, stretched, and pulled something from his pocket. It was a folded photograph, frayed at the edges. He handed it to her without explanation. In the picture, a young Luke smiled awkwardly, wearing fatigues, standing beside another man, taller, darker, laughing with an arm slung around Luke's shoulders. "My brother in arms," Luke said, "didn't make it home. I tried to save him. I didn't." Madison stared at the photo, her throat tightening. "I know that weight," she whispered. He nodded. "Then you know why I stop when I see someone in the rain." She held the picture with reverence, then handed it back. "You did more than stop," she said. "You made me feel human again." Luke said nothing, just nodded and pocketed the photo. As Madison walked away, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp leaves and earth. She didn't know where she was going yet, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid to find out. In her pocket, the motel key still rested like a promise. And behind her, Luke returned to the flowers, humming again, planting seeds he might never see bloom, but planting them anyway. The envelope was thick, stamped, sealed, and oddly formal, even by military standards. Madison found it wedged between junk mail and a pamphlet about veteran health services when she checked the small rusted mailbox at the transitional housing facility. She had only given out the address once to complete the paperwork for her upcoming administrative hearing. She tore the envelope open with her thumb, bracing herself for more bureaucracy, another form to complete another question, to defend another delay in the decision that would determine whether she received full veteran benefits or nothing at all. But the moment she read the first line, her breath caught. Supplemental testimony submitted. In support of subject Madison Greer, Lieutenant, retired. She blinked hard, reading the name again. Then again. It was real. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she scanned further. The language was formal government speak, dry and deliberate, but the content hit her like a sudden gust of wind. A man named Luke Harrison had submitted a first-hand account detailing a firefight in Fallujah, 2009. He had not been present during Madison's recent case, but his testimony tied to a separate but related incident years ago validated the pattern she had reported: repeated negligence of protocol by a high-ranking officer who now stood at the center of her tribunal. Luke's statement was calm, clear, and detailed, and deeply personal. "I don't know Lieutenant Greer beyond a brief meeting," he wrote, "but I've seen this before. I've carried the guilt of silence. If she has the courage to speak, then the least I can do is tell what I know." Madison sank onto the edge of her bed, hands trembling. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too sharp. She hadn't asked him. She hadn't even told him her full name. But he'd remembered. Somehow, in that short ride in that cold diner booth, he'd seen enough to believe her. Enough to risk being pulled into a system he had long since walked away from. And he'd done it anyway. The next day, Madison stood before the panel. 3 high-backed chairs, a long table, files and laptops, cold faces with warm words that didn't mean much. They asked her the same questions again. She gave the same answers. But this time, she wasn't alone. They acknowledged the supplemental testimony. Not just acknowledged it, changed the tone in the room. The woman in the center, a colonel with tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone, flipped through Luke's statement twice. Her voice softened. "You have someone speaking for you, Lieutenant? That doesn't happen often." Madison sat a little straighter. When it was over, they told her they would reach a decision within 2 weeks. She nodded, saluted, and walked out into the sunlight. The sky was finally clear. She didn't go back to her room, didn't feel like hiding between 4 cinder-block walls. Her feet led her down familiar sidewalks past brick buildings and faded flags until she found herself at the little diner again. The bell jingled when she walked in. The same waitress looked up from pouring coffee. "He's not here right now, honey," I know Madison replied. "I just needed to sit somewhere warm." The waitress gave her a look something between understanding and permission, then slid a coffee across the counter. "It's on the house." Madison sipped it slowly, letting the steam rise into her face. Then she pulled a folded note from her jacket. Not an official document. Just a thank-you letter. Personal. Honest. She had written it 3 times and torn it up each time. This version she kept. An hour later, she walked back to the church. The back gate was open. The leaves had started to turn the first golds and ambers of a slow-coming fall scattered along the gravel path. Luke was fixing a section of chain-link fence behind the playground. His jacket hung on a post, and Ellie, his daughter, sat cross-legged on a picnic bench nearby, drawing with markers on a notepad. When she saw Madison, her face lit up. "Dad, it's the rain lady." Luke looked up, a wrench still in hand. "Madison," she offered a sheepish wave. "Your daughter's got a good memory." Ellie held up a drawing. "It's you. I drew your army jacket and your boots. Want it?" Madison knelt down, touched by the simple gesture. The picture was crude but sweet, her under a gray sky, a stick figure in camouflage, smiling faintly. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. He didn't ask why she was there. She handed him the letter. "I didn't know how else to say thank you," she said, "but I wanted you to know what your words did." He took the note, but didn't open it. Just tucked it into his back pocket like it was something sacred. "I meant them," he said simply. "I know." A beat of silence passed. Wind rustled through the playground slide. Birds chirped as if the world had decided to start singing again. "I didn't think anyone would stand up for me," Madison admitted. "Not after all this time. Not someone who didn't even know me." "I didn't need to know." Luke said. "I've seen enough to recognize the look in someone's eyes when they're carrying more than they should." He paused, then added quietly, "I know what it's like to speak out too late." Madison looked at him. then not as a stranger who'd offered kindness in the rain, but as a man with his own scars, his own ghosts. And something else, the quiet strength of someone who decided to keep showing up even when no one was watching. "Sometimes late is still right on time," she said. Ellie ran up and took her hand. "Want to stay for dinner?" Luke hesitated. "Only if you're not in a hurry." Madison smiled. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't. And in that small moment, under an open sky with leaves beginning to fall, 3 people sat on a porch with spaghetti and lemonade. And not a single one of them was alone. There were certain silences. Madison had grown used to those heavy leaden ones that settled between soldiers who'd seen too much. The kind that didn't require words because everyone already understood. But the silence between her and Luke was different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't cold, it was steady, like the quiet hum of an engine that never failed to start. Like safety. That night after dinner, as Ellie curled up on the couch in her pajamas watching an old cartoon on low volume, Madison and Luke stood in the kitchen side by side rinsing dishes. The simplicity of it felt almost sacred. 2 adults sharing space, not in a rush to fill it with small talk or retreat into solitude. "You always cook that much spaghetti?" Madison asked, nudging him with her elbow. Luke half smiled. Occupational hazard. Grew up in a big family. Cooking less than 5 servings feels unnatural. She looked at him. Then really looked at him, not just the tired eyes or the faint scar near his temple, but the quiet lines of someone who'd lived hard and chose to keep loving anyway. "Were they all like you?" she asked. He paused for a beat, drying his hands. "Some better, some worse. I was the one who left and didn't come back until too much had changed." There was no bitterness in his voice, just fact, just history. Madison leaned against the counter. "You ever talk about what happened over there?" Luke shook his head. "Not unless it helps somebody else." She understood that, understood it too well. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded paper yellowed at the corners. Carefully he opened it and laid it on the table. It was a photo, Luke and another soldier, arms slung around each other, laughing in desert sun. "That's Mason," he said quietly. "He didn't make it home. Got hit in an IED blast while we were transporting wounded." Madison sat slowly, her breath catching. She'd seen so many of these pictures, smiling faces, frozen in time, men and women who wouldn't get a second chapter. "I was the one driving," Luke said. "We were supposed to rotate, but I told him to rest. I thought—" He stopped the words, cracking mid-sentence. "You thought you were protecting him," Madison finished gently. He nodded. "Instead, I gave him the front seat." Silence again, but not empty. Charged. Deep. "I carry a list in my head," Madison said after a moment. "Names, faces, birthdays. Things I should have done differently." Luke looked up. "You too, doesn't everyone?" He shrugged. "Some people bury it. Some drink it away. I fix fences and feed people I'll never see again." Madison reached for the photo, traced the corner. "Do you ever feel like you're making up for something you can't fix?" Luke met her gaze. "Every day." And just like that, something inside her shifted. Not broken, not cracked, but opened. A door long sealed shut. The next morning, Madison visited the Community Resource Center, where she'd once attended a job readiness seminar she barely remembered. This time, she wasn't just passing through. She filled out an application for a part-time program assisting veterans with reintegration, something Maria Torres had mentioned in passing weeks ago, but Madison hadn't been ready for then. Now, she was. Afterward, she returned to the church not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. Luke was out back again this time, repairing a swing set. The metal frame, rusted but sturdy. "Need a hand," she called. He didn't look surprised to see her, just passed her a wrench like it was the most natural thing in the world. As they worked, he nodded toward Ellie, who was on the steps coloring. "She's why I didn't spiral after I got out," he said softly. "When you've got someone depending on you, it changes the way you process pain." Madison tightened a bolt. You ever feel like you're just barely holding things together? Only on the days that end in E. She laughed, really laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Later, as they packed up the tools, Luke said, "You know, there's something I didn't tell you." Madison raised a brow. "That's ominous." He hesitated. "I didn't plan to testify. I didn't even know your full name until I heard the girl at the diner call you Lieutenant. I recognized the unit. Looked it up. What you were doing. It hit me." Madison waited, heart stilled. "You were trying to say what I never could, what I should have said when it was my turn." He met her eyes then, and there was nothing performative in it. No savior complex, no dramatic flair. Just a man who once walked away from his own truth and saw someone brave enough to do what he hadn't. "I didn't want to fail you, too," he added. Madison felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. Not from guilt, not even from sorrow, but from something deeper being seen. "I didn't think anyone noticed," she whispered. "I noticed," Luke said, "and I wasn't the only one." That night, as she walked back to her room under a cloud-streaked sky, Madison stopped at a mailbox on the corner. She held an envelope in her hand, a letter addressed not to an office or an appeal board, but to someone she hadn't spoken to in a long time, her younger brother Sam. He'd served, too. Left the military years before her. They hadn't spoken since the day she blew the whistle he'd thought it was a betrayal, that she should have kept quiet. But now she wanted him to know she didn't walk away, and neither did the man who stood with her when she didn't even know she needed it. She slid the letter into the box, exhaled slowly, and looked up. Above her, the clouds had parted just enough to show a single, shining star. Not much, but just enough. The next Saturday morning was soft and golden, the kind of autumn day that made you believe the world hadn't given up on beauty just yet. Sunlight filtered through amber leaves as Madison walked up the cracked walkway to Luke's modest home. The porch creaked as she stepped onto it. For the first time in a long while, her heart was oddly light. She wasn't sure if she was visiting as a friend or just someone trying to hold on to what made her feel steady. The screen door opened before she could knock. Ellie stood there, all gap-toothed grin and sleepy eyes, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and socks that didn't match. She didn't say hi or ask why Madison was there. She simply said, "You're just in time. We haven't started the pancakes yet." Madison blinked. "That's very specific hospitality." Ellie shrugged. "Dad always says people come back when they feel safe." Luke appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a towel, his hair still wet from the shower. "She's not wrong," he said, smiling. It was the first time Madison had seen him relaxed, unburdened by a wrench or a story. Just a man in his home on a Saturday flipping pancakes for a kid who still believed mornings were worth getting excited about. "You sure I'm not intruding?" Madison asked, hesitating on the step. Luke opened the door wider. "You sure you don't want blueberries in your pancakes?" That was his answer, and it was enough. They sat at the small table by the window, the kitchen warm with the smell of butter and cinnamon. Ellie chattered as she drew on the back of a grocery list, narrating a fantasy story about a brave lady soldier who built a secret treehouse for kids who had bad dreams. Madison listened with one elbow propped on the table, a smirk tugging at her lips. "She sounds like she has good taste in camouflage," she said. Ellie looked up. "You think so? I think she's kind of lonely. But she's good at pretending she isn't." Madison went still. Luke across the table didn't say a word, just glanced at his daughter, then at Madison. Children never needed to be taught how to see truth. They came with that gift. "I used to pretend a lot," Madison said, her voice low. "Still do sometimes." Ellie, unconcerned, returned to her drawing. Pretending is okay as long as someone notices you're doing it. The words landed like a stone in Madison's chest softly and all at once. She looked at Luke. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. Later, Ellie tugged Madison outside to the small backyard, which was more weeds than grass, but charming in its own unruly way. A half-built treehouse stood off-center near the back fence, its wooden frame still raw and unfinished. "We started this last year," Ellie said, pointing up. "But Dad got too busy. He said one day we'll finish it when life slows down." Madison squinted up at the structure. "You think it ever will slow down?" Ellie asked. Madison nodded. "Nope," Ellie said cheerfully, "but we can still finish the treehouse anyway." It was the kind of logic only a child could deliver, and somehow it made more sense than anything Madison had heard in months. "I think we can work with that," she murmured. She stepped back and surveyed the project. "You got a hammer." Ellie grinned and darted toward the shed. Luke walked out onto the porch just as Madison rolled up her sleeves. "I'm not sure you know what you're signing up for." "I built field barracks in monsoons," Madison said. "I think I can handle a treehouse." Luke tilted his head. "You're sure this isn't a tactical excuse to spend your Saturday with us, maybe? But at least I brought my own boots." They worked all afternoon, taking turns sawing, drilling balancing beams, while Ellie offered detailed architectural advice from the ground. Madison hadn't used her hands like this in years, not for anything that didn't involve signing forms, filling reports, or holding on through the night. As she drilled the last bolt into a crossbeam, she felt something inside her settle. A rhythm, a sense of place. It wasn't about building something tall or grand. It was about building something that didn't need to be perfect, only present. Just like people. By late afternoon, they sat on the porch steps with lemonade and tired arms. Ellie had passed out inside, curled up with her drawing pad still in hand. "She draws you a lot," Luke said. Madison chuckled. "I noticed. She told me last week that you reminded her of a hawk. A serious, strong kind of quiet, but always watching." Madison laughed softly. "That might be the best compliment I've ever gotten." Luke looked at her then, not just across the porch, but into her. The way people do when they've stopped being afraid to ask the questions that matter. "You ever think about staying?" The words hung in the air. Madison didn't flinch. "Sometimes," she said. "But I don't know if I know how." "You learn by trying," he said. "Same way you learn how to hold a hammer or read a kid's mind." She looked out over the yard, the treehouse standing proudly in the late light. "Maybe it's not about staying," she said slowly. "Maybe it's about choosing where to return to." Luke nodded. "That's a good place to start." As the sun dipped below the trees and evening stretched out over the quiet neighborhood, Madison felt a peace she hadn't trusted in years. Not because everything was perfect. Not because her past was erased or her future guaranteed. But because, for once, someone had noticed she was pretending, and simply chose to stay. Not to fix her, just to build something beside her, even if it started with a crooked treehouse and blueberry pancakes. By the time Madison stepped into the low-slung brick building labeled Veteran Resource and Renewal Center, the scent of brewed coffee and dry paper filled the air. It wasn't warm in the cozy sense more institutional, lined with posters about PTSD workshops and nutrition, but it was familiar, predictable, safe. She stood just inside the doorway, watching a group of 5 men and women gathered around a long table listening intently to a petite woman in her 50s with short silver-streaked hair and a clipboard. She was mid-sentence but paused when she noticed Madison. "You must be Lieutenant Greer," the woman said with a nod of recognition. "Maria Torres." Maria walked over her presence, calm but commanding, the kind of person who didn't need volume to be heard. Her handshake was firm and her eyes, clear, intelligent, missed nothing. "We've been following your hearing," Maria said without preamble. "I've read your reports. What you did was brave." Madison offered a polite smile. "Some people would say it was reckless." Maria returned a knowing look. "Usually the ones it exposes." Madison exhaled softly. "I'm not here for congratulations. I'm just trying to figure out where I fit now. You and half the people in this building." Maria gestured for her to follow. "Come, sit in for the second half of today's workshop. No pressure to speak. Just observe." They entered the back of the room. A circle of veterans sat, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, all bearing the quiet exhaustion of people who had returned from something no one else could see. Their faces were lined with years, stories, guilt, strength. Madison knew those expressions intimately. Today's topic is re-entry identity, Maria continued. Who you were in service, who you think you're supposed to be now, who you're allowed to become. One man spoke up first, maybe 50 hands, rough knees, bouncing with nervous energy. I feel like I was important once. Now I just get in the way at the grocery store. A woman added, I can't even sleep next to my husband anymore. He breathes too softly. I wake up thinking I've lost someone. Heads nodded, murmured agreements, and then a long silence. Maria turned to Madison. Lieutenant Madison stiffened slightly. She hadn't planned to talk, but the eyes around the room weren't demanding, just hopeful. She cleared her throat. I used to know exactly who I was. And then one day I said something that changed everything. I stood up for what I believed in, and lost my career, most of my friends, and a sense of belonging. Some days I wonder if it was worth it. No one interrupted. Madison continued. But a stranger stopped in the rain one night. He didn't know me, didn't ask what I'd done. He just saw I was tired and wet and alone, and for the first time in months I didn't feel invisible. The room was still. It reminded me that the uniform wasn't the only thing that made me worth saving. Maria, her voice soft, said, That's the kind of reminder most of us need. After the session, Madison stepped into the hallway, emotionally drained but strangely lighter. Maria walked beside her. I'd like you to consider joining our peer support facilitation program, she said. You've got experience, and more importantly, you've got presence. Madison raised an eyebrow. Presence. People listen when you speak, because you only speak when it matters. Madison laughed under her breath. I've been accused of being too quiet. Then let me reframe it, Maria said. You don't waste air. That's rare. Madison didn't give her answer right away, but something inside her already knew. That evening, Madison made her way back to Luke's place. She hadn't called ahead. Somehow, she didn't think she had to. The porch light was already on when she arrived. Ellie was lying on her stomach in the living room, drawing what looked like a castle with antennas. Luke sat on the couch reading an old paperback glasses sliding halfway down his nose. When Madison stepped inside, Ellie looked up and announced, I drew you again. Madison laughed. Oh, what am I doing this time? Ellie held up the picture. It was a stick figure version of Madison standing in front of a classroom of other stick figures, all of them smiling. You're helping the ones with invisible OEs, she explained. Like Daddy's shoulder, but in their heads. Madison blinked. Luke set his book aside. You okay? She nodded slowly. I think I might have found something today. Or maybe it found me. He waited. I was in a room full of people carrying things no one else could see, and they weren't pretending they were fine. I didn't either, and it felt honest. Luke's voice was steady. That's more rare than you think. She walked over to the couch, sat beside him. Maria thinks I could help. Not with answers, just by being there. Holding space. Luke smiled. Funny. That's how I see what I do every day. I don't fix the fence so people stop falling down. I fix it so they know someone still cares if they fall. Madison looked at him. You think I can do that too. I think you've already started. Much later that night, as Luke tucked Ellie into bed, she whispered something that made him pause. Daddy. Yeah. When people help, does that make them family? He smiled and brushed her hair back. Sometimes, yeah. The best kind. The kind you choose. Ellie yawned. Then I think Madison's family. Luke didn't answer right away. Just kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp. In the hallway, Madison waited, eyes misty. She'd heard it. Didn't mean to eavesdrop, she said softly. I'm glad you did. They stood there in the half-light, something unsaid lingering between them. Not romantic, not quite, at least not yet, but real, rooted, growing. Because sometimes when the rain doesn't choose sides, neither do the people who reach out their hands. And Madison was starting to believe. Maybe she'd been chosen too. The sky darkened faster than usual that Wednesday, as if the clouds themselves were remembering something heavy. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, whistling through the gutters like a warning. Madison stared out the window of the community center, watching leaves swirl across the parking lot. She was supposed to lead her first peer support session that evening. Maria had told her she was ready. The veterans trusted her. She'd earned this moment. But she couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. Something was wrong. An hour later at Luke's house, the phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter. Luke silenced it with a sigh. He was standing over the stove stirring a pot of soup with one hand, rubbing his temples with the other. Ellie lay on the couch, pale and groggy cheeks flushed with fever. He'd already called off his shift at the church and the part-time night job he'd recently picked up to cover repairs on the truck. He couldn't afford to miss it, but Ellie came first. Always had. He placed a damp cloth across her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open. "Are you staying?" she mumbled. "Of course I'm staying," he whispered, brushing her hair back. "I'm right here." She nodded sleepily, her little hand curling around his finger. At the same moment, Madison pulled into the driveway with 2 paper bags balanced in her arms. She had picked up groceries after her orientation milk tea children's medicine and Luke's favorite instant coffee. She hadn't planned to stay, but something told her he might need backup. The door creaked open before she could knock. Luke looked exhausted, his flannel sleeves rolled up the worry plane in the lines around his eyes. "Okay," Madison asked, gently stepping in. "She's burning up," he said. "I've been giving her fluids, but her breathing's shallow. If it doesn't break by morning, we'll need to go in." Madison set the bags down and knelt beside Ellie, touching the girl's clammy skin. "Let me help," she said softly. "You look like you haven't slept since last year." Luke didn't argue. He just sat heavily at the kitchen table, eyes distant, hand pressed to the back of his neck like he was holding himself together by instinct alone. As the rain began to lash against the windows, Madison made tea and brought him a cup. He stared into it like it held some kind of answer. "She's all I've got," he said finally, voice rough. "I know," Madison said. "No, I mean she's all I've got. There's no backup plan. No family to call. No one to take her if something happens to me. If I fall apart, you won't." He looked at her hollow and bare. "I can't afford to." Madison sat across from him, steady and firm. "Then let me be the part you lean on." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to." "Maybe not," she said. "But you stopped for me in the rain. You didn't have to then, either." Silence. Then, almost too softly to hear, he murmured, "I'm scared." Madison reached across the table, her hand closing over his. "You don't have to be. Not alone." The night deepened. Thunder rolled low across the hills. Madison stayed. She helped Luke sponge Ellie's forehead, read her books aloud when she stirred, and sat with Luke through the long stretches of quiet. At 2 a.m., the fever finally broke. Ellie, still half asleep, murmured, "Did the storm go away?" Madison kissed her temple. "Not yet, sweetheart. But we're here with you." In the living room, Luke exhaled so deeply it was almost a sob. He rubbed his face and stood slowly, muscles aching from tension and hours of stillness. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to stay." "I wasn't leaving," Madison replied. And she meant it. The next morning brought a fragile calm. Sunlight broke through the clouds in streaks, drying the sidewalks and painting the wet leaves in shades of fire and gold. Ellie sat up on the couch, sipping warm broth. Madison sat beside her, gently braiding the girl's tangled hair. Luke stepped outside for a moment of air, the first he'd taken in what felt like days. When he came back in, he found Madison kneeling near Ellie's backpack, helping her sort out school papers and coloring pages. She looked up, smiled softly. "Guess I missed my session last night," she said. He tilted his head. "You led one here." She stood and brushed off her knees. "I never imagined myself part of a family again. Not like this. Not—" Quietly. Luke stepped closer. "It's not quiet. It's just not loud in the way we were trained to hear." He paused. "You could stay, you know. I mean, not permanently if you're not ready. Just longer. As long as you want." Madison looked at him. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with the steady, measured understanding of someone who'd known battlefields of every kind and finally found one worth defending with tenderness. "I already have," she said. That afternoon, after Ellie drifted into a deep, healing sleep, Madison stepped outside. The porch was warm in the late sun. She pulled out her notebook, the one she hadn't touched in months. She opened to a blank page and wrote one line, "You don't need to be strong alone. You just need someone who won't walk away." She closed the book gently. Inside, Luke was humming a familiar tune as he washed the soup pot. There were no trumpets, no victory parades, just two hands moving in rhythm and the quiet hum of a house that, for the first time in a long time, felt like home. The storm had come and passed, but what stayed behind was something far more powerful. The community center was quiet that morning. No footsteps in the hall, no shuffling chairs or murmured greetings. Just sunlight filtering through the dusty blinds and the soft click of Maria's pen tapping against her clipboard. Madison sat across from her in the office, hands folded over a piece of stationery. She had borrowed it from the front desk, a plain white page with a faint navy border. No emblem, no insignia, just space. The words were already written, in ink, in her own voice. Maria hadn't asked what was in the letter. She simply said, "When you're ready." Madison wasn't sure she was, but she was here, and that had to count for something. The night before, after Luke and Ellie had gone to bed, Madison had walked out onto the porch alone. The air was cool, still carrying the scent of the storm. She sat with her knees drawn up, the notebook open in her lap, heart heavier than she'd expected. She had meant to write something simple. A thank you, perhaps. A reflection on how far she had come. But what came out was something else entirely. It started with, "To the stranger who stopped in the rain. You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask what I had done or what I had lost. You only saw that I was cold-tired and human. And in a world that constantly asks us to prove our worth, that was the most radical kindness I've ever known." The rest of the letter spilled like breath slow, careful, full of things she hadn't allowed herself to say. She wrote about the day she filed her report, about the silence that followed, the colleagues who looked the other way, the commanding officer who called her emotional, the months of investigations, the nights she barely slept. She wrote about the fear that no one would ever believe her again. And then she wrote about him, Luke, how one act of decency cracked something open, how he never asked for anything in return, how Ellie's quiet acceptance healed places inside Madison that even the military couldn't reach. "You gave me shelter," she wrote, "but more than that, you gave me a reason to believe that the war I fought was not for nothing." When she finished the letter, she stared at it for a long time. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like continuation. Back in the present, Maria gestured toward the open door. "The group's starting." "You still want to read it?" Madison nodded. "Yes, I think they need to hear it. I think I do." They entered the common room. A dozen veterans sat in the circle, familiar faces now. One man with a prosthetic leg balanced a cup of coffee on his knee. A woman with salt and pepper braids nodded as Madison took her seat. Maria gave her a quiet nod. It was time. Madison cleared her throat. "I wrote this last night," she said. "I didn't know I needed to until I did. It's not directed at anyone in particular, but maybe you'll see parts of yourself in it." "I know I did." She unfolded the letter and began to read. Silence settled as she spoke, not the hollow kind, but full and reverent. Madison's voice didn't shake, not from fear, but from depth. Each word landed like a soft footfall on sacred ground. When she reached the end, her final line, "I am not healed, but I am no longer invisible." There wasn't applause, there were no cheers, only the kind of stillness that meant people were listening, and one by one, veterans began to nod. The man with the prosthetic whispered, "That's the first time I've heard someone say what I've felt." Another woman reached over and touched Madison's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for carrying that until the rest of us could hear it." Maria, standing in the back of the room, blinked back something close to tears. Later, she told Madison that letter was a mirror, and for the first time some of them saw their reflection and didn't look away. That afternoon, Madison placed a copy of the letter in a sealed envelope and handed it to Maria. "For the new guys," she said, "in case they come in on a day I can't be here." Maria smiled. "You will always be here, even when you're not." Outside, the autumn wind picked up scattering leaves across the sidewalk like gold coins from a broken jar. Madison stood under the awning watching them fall. She thought about Luke, how he'd told her once that helping people wasn't about fixing them. It was about not walking away when the pain made them hard to love. She understood that now, because someone had stayed, and now so would she. That evening, Luke was back at the church repairing a leaky pipe when Madison arrived. She didn't say anything at first, just sat on the steps watching the golden light filter through the stained glass. He joined her after a while, wiping his hands on a rag, the familiar warmth of his presence settling beside her. She pulled the original letter from her bag and handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly, reading in silence. When he finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, "You didn't have to say any of this. I know," she replied, "but I wanted you to know how far one good man's choice can go." Luke looked at her, really looked. "You're not invisible either," he said, and in that moment, no one was. Not the girl in the rain, not the man with the wrench, not the little girl inside sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The letter had begun in the storm, but where it ended was here, in sunlight, with hearts still mending, but no longer alone. The first frost of the season came with little warning. A thin veil of silver clung to rooftops, curled around the edges of windows, and coated the town in a soft, silent shimmer. Madison rose early, tugging on a thick sweater, her breath visible in the dim kitchen light as she poured 2 mugs of coffee, one black one with cream. Luke would be arriving soon to help prep for the veterans' morning workshop. But even before he knocked, she heard the familiar rhythm of his boots on the porch. She opened the door with a smile. "Do you ever knock?" she asked. He lifted one brow. "Would it make me more polite, or just less predictable?" She handed him the coffee. "Both." Luke stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. His cheeks were pink from the chill, his eyes a little heavier than usual. "You all right?" Madison asked, closing the door behind him. He nodded, then hesitated. "Got a letter last night." Madison set her mug down. From who Luke pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. He handed it to her unsealed. Her eyes scanned the header center for veteran reintegration and community support position offer. Transitional support trainer. Her brows rose. "This is, they want me to join, full-time," Luke said. "Facilitate field workshops, train incoming volunteers, even speak on behalf of the center during community outreach events." Madison's heart jumped. "That's incredible." Luke didn't smile. I turned it down. The silence was sudden, sharp. "You what?" She said, not out of judgment, but disbelief. He ran a hand through his hair. "I've got Ellie. I've got the church work. You've got a chance to step into something bigger than you," Madison cut in gently. "You know that, right?" He looked at her. "I do, and it terrifies me." Madison sat on the armrest of the couch mug balanced on her knee. "Why?" she asked softer now. "Because I already tried being someone once. When I was a corpsman. When I thought maybe I mattered. And when I lost Mason, when I came back broken, I wasn't useful anymore. I was just..." a man who used to be something. She let his words hang in the air, let the truth of them settle like dust. Then she said, "You've never stopped being someone, Luke. You just stopped believing other people needed you. But they do. I do." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I'm not sure I know how to lead anymore," he murmured. Madison got up, walked over and placed the letter back in his hand. Then, do it scared. Later that week, Luke accepted the offer. Quietly, no announcement, no celebration. Just a nod to Maria across the hall, a signature on a dotted line, and the understanding that he was finally walking back into something that had once broken him with new strength, and this time not alone. Madison watched from the doorway as he met with the program director, his posture straight, his voice calm. When their eyes met across the room, he gave her the smallest smile. It was enough. The following Sunday, Ellie stood proudly beside the nearly finished treehouse as Luke fastened the final railing into place. Madison helped secure the ladder, and the three of them stepped back to admire their handiwork. "Looks crooked," Luke said. "Looks real," Madison replied. Ellie twirled in the grass. "It looks like it belongs here," and that Madison thought was the whole point. That afternoon they set up a small picnic beneath the tree. Ellie arranged her dolls in a perfect row. Luke brought out sandwiches and too many napkins. Madison brought the last piece of her past that needed releasing, a folded letter she hadn't shown anyone. She'd written it to herself, to the soldier version of her, to the woman who thought courage was loud and lonely. You don't have to carry the burden alone to be brave. You just have to keep showing up even when you're tired, especially when you're tired. Luke noticed the letter in her hand. "Another one?" he asked. Madison smiled. "The last one." She tucked it beneath a stone by the treehouse base. A small ritual, a quiet goodbye. That evening, as twilight softened the sky, Luke pulled a small hand-carved plaque from his truck. Madison watched as he climbed up the treehouse ladder and nailed it above the entryway. When he came down, Ellie clapped. Madison leaned in to read the inscription. "Welcome home. No more rain, no more waiting. Just wood and nails and people choosing each other again and again." Back inside, Ellie fell asleep with a flashlight in hand and her favorite book open across her chest. Madison tucked the blanket around her shoulders. Luke stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression soft. "She loves you," he said quietly. Madison turned. "I love her." Luke took a step forward. "She's not the only one." The room seemed to hold its breath, and Madison, after all she had endured, didn't step back, didn't second-guess. She simply whispered, "I know." They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something passed between them, firm, unspoken, and more real than anything that could be rushed. A promise not of perfection, but of presence. Of staying. That night, as the wind gently rustled through the trees, Madison lay awake beneath the same roof she once hesitated to enter. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers laced over her chest, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't fighting anymore. Not for validation. Not for survival. Just for joy. For peace. For the kind of love that showed up in the rain and never left. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind that stayed. The knock came just after breakfast. Not rushed, not timid. 3 firm taps on the door like someone who belonged there, even if they hadn't been there before. Madison looked up from her cup of tea still warm in her hands. Luke glanced toward the front door with a flicker of curiosity. Ellie was coloring at the kitchen table, humming softly to herself, oblivious. Luke opened the door. A sharply dressed woman in her early 40s stood on the porch. Her dark wool coat was still dusted with the last flakes of morning frost. Her clipboard was tucked against her chest, but it was the badge clipped to her lapel that caught Madison's attention. Veteran Advocacy and Outreach, National Office. "Luke Harrison," the woman asked, glancing past him to the living room. "Yes," he said cautiously. She smiled. "You were referred by Maria Torres and the local reintegration board. May I come in?" Madison stood up instinctively. Luke stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. "I'm Joanna Fields," the woman said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "I'm part of the national initiative focused on expanding local veteran programs, particularly ones led by former service members like yourself." Luke nodded once, still unsure where this was headed. "You came across our radar after submitting your testimony for Lieutenant Madison Greer," she continued, now turning toward Madison. "And then again, when you accepted a support training role. We've been reviewing your background." Madison stepped closer, protective. "Reviewing why?" Joanna smiled, unshaken. "Because we believe stories like yours, both of yours, can do more than help individuals. They can inspire reform, community action, even national dialogue." Luke's brow furrowed. "I'm not a speaker. I'm not a poster child." Joanna nodded. "That's exactly why we need you. Because you're real. Because you stopped when others didn't. Because you carry the story people need to hear." She pulled a sealed folder from her satchel and handed it to Luke. "There's a summit in Washington next month, focused on rehumanizing the reintegration process. We'd like you to join the panel. Talk about what happens after the uniform comes off. We want your voice, your experience, your integrity." Luke opened the folder slowly. Inside was a formal invitation, reimbursement for travel, a speaking itinerary, his name printed in bold. He exhaled. "I'm a single dad. We have accommodations for families. You'd all be welcome." Joanna looked between them both. "You don't have to decide now. Just consider what a room full of decision-makers could learn from someone who chose kindness over convenience." After she left, silence filled the space. Ellie broke it first. "Does this mean we get to go to Washington like in my book report?" Madison knelt beside her. "Maybe. It's a big deal." Ellie grinned. "I could draw a map for us." Luke sat heavily on the arm of the couch, invitation still open in his hands. "I didn't ask for any of this." Madison sat beside him. "Neither did I. But that didn't stop it from finding you." He looked at her. "You think I should do it?" She hesitated, not because she doubted his ability, but because she knew what he was really asking. Could he speak about what he'd buried? Could he stand in a room full of strangers and open the door to wounds long covered? "You don't owe the world your story," she said gently. "But if you're ready, if you want to use it to build something, then maybe this is the moment that story stops being about pain and starts being about purpose." Luke looked down at the folder again. "I've spent years feeling like I didn't do enough, like kindness wasn't enough." Madison touched his hand. "But it was. It is. You changed my life, Luke, that night in the rain. That wasn't small. That was everything." They talked about it over dinner. Madison, Luke, and Ellie, who was already suggesting they visit the Lincoln Memorial and some place that sells pancakes shaped like states. By nightfall, Luke had made his decision. Not with a speech, not with fanfare, but by quietly placing the folder on the kitchen table and beginning to fill out the acceptance form. The next few weeks moved quickly. Maria helped him prep with mock interviews and presentation tips. Madison rewrote parts of his old journal entries into outlines he could draw from. Ellie designed a tiny cardboard model of the Capitol building and insisted they practice his speech beside it. And through it all, something shifted between Luke and Madison, not rushed, not dramatic, but deeply rooted. They were no longer two people orbiting the same hurt. They were becoming partners in healing. The night before they left for Washington, Madison stepped onto the porch and found Luke leaning on the railing. His arms folded, his eyes searching the stars. "Can I tell you something?" he said. She joined him, nodding. "That night I picked you up. I almost didn't stop." She turned to him, surprised. "I saw the uniform, the soaked bag, the look on your face, and I thought, she's just like me, and if I stop, I might have to feel something again." Madison waited, heart quiet. "But I stopped, and I felt everything. And it was worth it." She reached for his hand. "I'm glad you did." They stood like that a long time, the night wrapped around them. Two people who had no intention of becoming heroes but had chosen decency when it mattered most. And now they were about to walk into a room that could echo that choice far beyond a rainy night on a lonely road. Because sometimes the knock that changes everything isn't the one on your door. It's the one you answered without expecting anything in return. And for Luke Harrison, that knock had already come. Now it was his turn to pass it forward. The stage lights were softer than Madison expected, more like a morning sun filtering through church windows than the sharp glare of a spotlight. Still, the large conference room hummed with quiet energy. Rows of listeners, veterans, counselors, lawmakers, students sat forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the man standing at the podium. Luke Harrison stood, steady hands resting lightly on the edges of the lectern. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his boots scuffed but clean. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been through it and didn't need polish to prove he mattered. Madison sat near the front, Ellie on her lap, the child unusually still. She gripped her father's dog tags in one hand, twirling them absent-mindedly as if they were a talisman. Luke cleared his throat. The microphone caught even the smallest shift in his breath. Then he began. "I never imagined I'd be here," he said. "I'm not a general, not a politician, not a decorated hero. I'm just a single dad from a small town who once forgot he had something to offer." A hush settled across the room. There was a time I thought my story ended with regret. I thought the best thing I could do for the world was stay quiet, stay small, stay out of the way. I was wrong. He paused, glancing at Madison. She gave him a quiet nod, her chest tight. Because then one night in the rain I saw someone who looked like I felt, someone carrying things the world couldn't see. And I stopped. Just that. I stopped. He looked down at the lectern, his voice thickening. And that choice, it didn't just help her, it saved me too. He straightened, hands steady again. We talk a lot about serving, about sacrifice. But I've learned something in the years since I took off. The uniform service doesn't end when you come home. Sometimes it begins again, in quieter ways, with one act of kindness. One person choosing not to walk away. A ripple of stillness spread through the room. Some blinked back tears. Others simply sat with faces turned inward as if remembering their own moment, someone who stayed. Someone who saw them. Luke continued, "You don't have to fix everything. You just have to show up. For your neighbor, your daughter, a stranger on the side of the road. Because the most lasting change doesn't happen in policy, it happens in presence." And then he ended with words that no one in the audience would forget. "I didn't write a speech. I just wrote a letter once. And that letter came back to me not on paper but in the way someone chose to stay in my life. And in that staying, I found my place again." The standing ovation was slow to rise, but it rose. Not out of politeness, out of truth. Madison stood, tears in her eyes, Ellie clapping fiercely beside her. When Luke stepped off the stage, Madison met him halfway. She said nothing at first, only reached up and pulled him into a hug. A full, grounding, steady hug. "You did it," she whispered. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. "No," he said. "We did." Later that evening, back in the small hotel room, Ellie fell asleep clutching her favorite stuffed animal and wearing a lanyard with her VIP youth guest badge proudly displayed. Luke and Madison sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker beneath a soft navy sky. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was full, not empty. Finally, Madison reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. A fresh one, handwritten. Luke looked at it surprised. Another letter. She smiled. The last one. "This time, I'm sending it." "To who?" She turned the envelope so he could read the name. "To any soldier who thinks the battle is over when the war ends." Luke blinked. "Where's it going?" "Maria's putting together a welcome package for veterans re-entering civilian life. This'll be part of it." She exhaled. They'll get a letter from someone who survived the silence, someone who still believes that the rain doesn't mean the journey ends. It just makes the next step harder and more worth it. Luke reached for her hand. Their fingers twined together like it had always been meant that way. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I'm proud of us," she replied. Back home a week later, the treehouse stood taller somehow, even though no one had touched it since they left. Maybe it was the new coat of paint Ellie had begged for. Or maybe, just maybe, it stood taller because of what had been built around it. Trust, second chances, and a kind of love that wasn't rushed but earned. Madison walked into the backyard alone that afternoon and tucked another folded note beneath the plaque Luke had carved. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. "Dear, whoever you are, I hope someone stops for you. I hope someone holds the door, brings the coffee, keeps the light on. Because you matter, even when the world forgets. And when the rain comes, and it will, I hope you remember this. The people who stay, the ones who see you, they are the miracle." The rain had come, but it was no longer where her story ended. It was where it began. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what part of this story resonated most with you? If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. We share stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the quiet strength in everyday kindness. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the goodness of people.